It was supposed to be the most important day in David Chen's career. After 15 years of building his company from a small garage startup into one of the country's leading manufacturing firms, he finally had the chance to close the deal that would change everything. 3 major investors from overseas were touring his factory, and if everything went according to plan, they would sign a contract worth $50 million before the day was over. David straightened his tie for the 10th time that morning as he watched the black luxury cars pull up to the factory entrance. His palms were sweating despite the air conditioning running at full blast. These weren't just any investors. They represented some of the biggest manufacturing companies in Asia, and landing this contract would put his company on the global map. The factory floor buzzed with nervous energy. David had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Every machine had been inspected twice, every surface polished until it gleamed, and every employee had been briefed on what to expect. The tour route was planned to perfection, starting with the smaller production lines and building up to the grand finale, the crown jewel of his operation. At the heart of the factory stood a massive automated assembly machine that cost more than most people's houses. This wasn't just any ordinary piece of equipment. It was a marvel of modern engineering, standing 3 stories tall and stretching the length of a football field. The machine could produce thousands of precision components every hour, working with accuracy that no human hand could match. It was this machine that had made David's company famous in manufacturing circles. The investors stepped out of their cars dressed in sharp business suits and carrying expensive briefcases. David greeted them with his biggest smile, shaking hands, and exchanging pleasantries. The lead investor, Mr. Takeshi, was a serious man in his 60s who had built his reputation on spotting profitable opportunities. His sharp eyes took in every detail as they entered the building. The tour began smoothly. David guided his guests through the smaller production areas, explaining how raw materials were transformed into finished products. The investors nodded approvingly as they watched workers operating various machines with practiced skill. Everything was going exactly as David had rehearsed. His confidence grew with each passing minute. As they moved through the facility, David couldn't help but notice one of the summer workers following at a distance. The young man looked to be around 19 or 20, with calloused hands and clothes that had seen better days. Unlike the other employees who tried to look busy whenever the group passed by, this kid seemed genuinely interested in the machines themselves. He would stop and study each piece of equipment with the kind of focus that reminded David of his own early days as an engineer. The boy's name was Tommy Morrison, though David didn't know it at the time. Tommy had started working at the factory just 2 months earlier, taking a job in the packaging department to earn money for his family's farm. While other summer workers counted down the hours until quitting time, Tommy spent his breaks walking around the factory floor, fascinated by the complex machinery that surrounded him. What David also didn't know was that Tommy had grown up around machines. His father had taught him about engines, circuits, and mechanical systems from the time he could hold a wrench. While other kids played video games, Tommy had spent his afternoons in his father's workshop, learning to diagnose problems by sound alone and understanding how different parts worked together in harmony. As the tour group approached the main production area, David's excitement reached its peak. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the chance to show off his prized machine in all its glory. The massive assembly line dominated the space, its metallic arms moving in perfect synchronization as sparks flew from welding stations, and precision tools shaped raw steel into complex components. "Gentlemen," David announced with pride in his voice, "this is what sets us apart from every other manufacturer in the region. This machine can produce components with accuracy measured in fractions of millimeters. It never gets tired, never makes mistakes, and can work around the clock." The investors gathered around as David began explaining the technical specifications. The machine's computer screens displayed real-time data showing production rates, quality measurements, and efficiency statistics. Everything looked perfect on paper, and the investors seemed impressed by the numbers they were seeing. But then something went wrong. It started with a small grinding sound that most people wouldn't have noticed. Tommy, who was restocking supplies nearby, immediately looked up from his work. His trained ear caught the subtle change in the machine's rhythm. a slight hesitation in what should have been smooth, continuous motion. Within seconds, the grinding became louder. Warning lights began flashing on the control panel, and the rhythmic hammering of the assembly line started to slow down. David felt his stomach drop as he realized what was happening, but he tried to maintain his composure in front of the investors. "Just a minor adjustment needed," he said with a forced smile, though sweat was beginning to form on his forehead. "These machines are so sensitive that they alert us to even the smallest irregularities." But the situation was getting worse by the second. The grinding sound turned into a loud screeching noise that echoed throughout the factory. The massive, robotic arms that had been moving with ballet-like precision suddenly jerked to a stop. Red warning lights bathed everything in an ominous glow, and an alarm began blaring loud enough to be heard over all the other factory noise. David's worst nightmare was unfolding right before his eyes. The machine that was supposed to impress his investors had just suffered a complete breakdown at the worst possible moment. Workers throughout the factory stopped what they were doing and stared at the silent production line. The sudden quiet was almost more disturbing than the alarms had been. "I'm sure our maintenance team can have this resolved quickly," David said, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to sound confident. But inside, panic was setting in. This machine was the centerpiece of his entire operation. If it was down, for more than a few hours, it would cost thousands of dollars in lost production. If it was down for days, it could bankrupt the company. The factory's head engineer came running over, followed by 2 technicians carrying toolboxes and diagnostic equipment. David watched hopefully as they opened control panels and began running tests. But the expressions on their faces told him everything he needed to know. They had no idea what was wrong. Minutes turned into an hour as the engineers tried everything they could think of. They checked electrical connections, tested computer systems, and examined every component they could reach. The investors stood, patiently at first, but David could see their enthusiasm fading with each passing minute. Mr. Takeshi kept checking his watch and whispering to his colleagues in Japanese. Tommy continued working nearby, but his attention was completely focused on the broken machine. While the engineers were looking at computer screens and running diagnostic programs, Tommy was listening to the sounds the machine made when they tried to restart it. His father had taught him that machines often tell you what's wrong with them, if you know how to listen. The situation was becoming desperate. David's dream deal was slipping away with every minute that passed. The investors were starting to look at their phones and mention other appointments they needed to attend. The reputation he had spent 15 years building was crumbling in real time, and there seemed to be nothing anyone could do to stop it. The factory floor had become a scene of barely controlled chaos. David watched in horror as his senior engineers huddled around the massive machine, their faces growing more frustrated by the minute. They had been working for over an hour now, and the investors were clearly losing patience. Mr. Takeshi had already stepped aside to take 2 phone calls, and David could see him glancing toward the exit. The head engineer, a man named Peterson, who had 20 years of experience, wiped sweat from his forehead as he emerged from behind a control panel. His expression told David everything he needed to know before he even spoke. "I'm sorry, sir," Peterson said quietly, trying not to let the investors overhear. "We've run every diagnostic test we have. The computer systems are all showing green lights, but something is causing a cascade failure in the mechanical components. Without taking the entire machine apart, which would take days, I can't pinpoint the exact problem." David felt his world crashing down around him. Days. He didn't have days. He barely had minutes before these investors walked out the door and took his future with them. His hands were shaking as he tried to think of something, anything, that could save the situation. Meanwhile, Tommy had been watching everything unfold from his position near the packaging station. While the engineers focused on their computer screens and diagnostic equipment, Tommy had been using his ears. His father had always told him that machines talked to you if you knew how to listen. And this machine was definitely trying to say something. The sound it made when they attempted to restart it wasn't random. There was a pattern to it, a specific rhythm that reminded Tommy of the old tractor back home when the timing belt was slightly off. But this was more complex, like multiple problems happening at the same time. Tommy found himself walking closer to the machine, drawn by curiosity and a genuine desire to understand what was going wrong. He had spent his lunch breaks for the past 2 months studying this equipment, fascinated by its complexity. While other workers saw it as just another machine, Tommy saw it as a puzzle, thousands of parts working together in perfect harmony when everything was right. As he got closer, Tommy noticed something the engineers had missed. They were so focused on the main control systems that they hadn't paid attention to a smaller sensor array on the side of the machine. One of the sensors was blinking in an irregular pattern, not the steady green light it should have been showing. Tommy knew he shouldn't interfere. He was just a summer worker in the packaging department. These were professional engineers with college degrees and years of experience. Who was he to think he could solve a problem they couldn't? But something about that blinking sensor bothered him. It reminded him of a similar issue he had helped his father fix on a piece of farm equipment just last month. David was getting desperate. The investors were now openly discussing their travel schedules and talking about cutting the meeting short. 15 years of building his company, months of preparation for this day, and it was all falling apart because of one machine breakdown. In his frustration, David noticed Tommy standing near the machine, studying it with intense concentration. The young man's focus was so complete that he seemed oblivious to all the chaos around him. Something about the kid's confidence irritated David. Here were professional engineers unable to solve the problem, and this summer worker was acting like he understood something they didn't. "You think you can fix what our top engineers can't?" David snapped, his stress and embarrassment making his voice harsher than usual. "Maybe you should stick to packing boxes instead of pretending to be a mechanic." Tommy looked up, startled by the sharp tone. For a moment he seemed ready to walk away and return to his workstation. But then he looked back at the machine, and David could see something in the young man's eyes. Not arrogance, but genuine concern. "I might be able to help," Tommy said quietly, his voice steady despite David's hostility. "I think I know what's causing the problem." The engineers looked up from their work, some of them rolling their eyes at the suggestion that a packaging worker could solve what they couldn't. But David was desperate enough to consider any option, no matter how unlikely. "Fine," David said, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "You've got 5 minutes. But when you can't fix it either, I don't want to hear any excuses." Tommy nodded and approached the machine with calm confidence. While the engineers had been focused on the main computer systems, Tommy went straight to the sensor array he had noticed earlier. He knelt down and examined the connections, his hands moving with surprising skill and precision. The investors, curious about this unexpected development, moved closer to watch. Mr. Takeshi seemed particularly interested in seeing how this would play out. Tommy was aware of the attention but didn't let it distract him from his examination of the machine. Within minutes, Tommy had identified the first part of the problem. The sensor he had noticed wasn't just malfunctioning. It was receiving conflicting signals from 2 different systems. This was causing the machine's computer to receive mixed information about the position of critical components. But that wasn't the only issue. As Tommy traced the sensor connections, he discovered that someone had recently updated the machine's software without adjusting the calibration settings for the hardware. The new software was expecting responses that the old calibration couldn't provide, creating a perfect storm of communication failures. Tommy worked methodically, his movements efficient and purposeful. He didn't have fancy diagnostic tools like the engineers, but he had something else, an intuitive understanding of how mechanical and electronic systems work together. His father had taught him to see the big picture, to understand how changing one thing could affect everything else. Engineers watched in growing amazement as Tommy identified problems they had completely overlooked. Peterson, who had initially been skeptical, found himself asking questions about Tommy's approach. The young man explained his reasoning in simple terms, pointing out the logical connections between different systems. "The computer thinks everything is fine because the software is running correctly," Tommy explained as he made careful adjustments to the calibration settings. "But the hardware is trying to tell it that something is wrong. When they can't communicate properly, the safety systems shut everything down to prevent damage." David watched in stunned silence as Tommy worked. This wasn't luck or guesswork. The kid clearly understood exactly what he was doing. His movements were confident and precise, like someone who had been working with complex machinery his entire life. After 20 minutes of careful work, Tommy stepped back from the machine. "Try starting it now," he said simply. Peterson looked skeptical but activated the startup sequence. The machine's computers ran through their initialization process, and for a moment nothing happened. Then slowly, the massive mechanical arms began to move. The grinding noise was gone, replaced by the smooth rhythmic sounds of properly functioning equipment. The production line came back to life with a satisfying hum. Components began moving along the conveyor belts. Robotic welders resumed their precise work, and the control panel showed all green lights across the board. The machine was not just running, it was running better than it had in weeks. The factory floor erupted in amazed murmurs as workers realized what had just happened. The summer kid from packaging had solved a problem that had stumped the professional engineers. David stared at Tommy with a mixture of shock and growing curiosity. The investors were clearly impressed, not just by the quick resolution, but by the unexpected source of the solution. Mr. Takeshi approached Tommy with obvious interest, and David realized that this moment might actually strengthen rather than destroy his chances of closing the deal. The silence that followed the machine's successful restart was almost deafening. David stood frozen, watching the production line operate with a smoothness he hadn't seen in months. The rhythmic sounds of precision manufacturing filled the air, and every indicator light glowed a healthy green. It was as if the machine had never been broken at all. Mr. Takeshi was the first to break the silence. He walked over to Tommy with measured steps, his experienced eyes studying the young man with new interest. The other investors followed, their earlier impatience replaced by genuine curiosity about what they had just witnessed. "That was quite impressive," Mr. Takeshi said, his accent giving weight to each word. "I have been in manufacturing for 30 years, and I have rarely seen such efficient problem-solving. Where did you learn to work with machinery like this?" Tommy shifted uncomfortably under the attention of the well-dressed businessman. He was used to working in the background, invisible among the factory's hundreds of employees. Being the center of attention made him nervous, especially when these men were clearly important enough to make his boss sweat. "My father taught me," Tommy replied simply, his voice quiet but steady. "He always said that machines aren't really that complicated once you understand how they think." David found himself stepping closer, his own curiosity now overriding his embarrassment about the earlier breakdown. There was something about this kid that didn't add up. Summer workers were supposed to pack boxes and sweep floors, not diagnose complex engineering problems that stumped experienced professionals. "Your father?" David pressed. "What does he do for a living? Is he an engineer at another factory?" Tommy's expression grew slightly guarded, the way people's faces change when they're asked about family matters they'd rather keep private. "He's a farmer now," he said after a pause. "But he used to work with machines like this. He taught me everything he knows about how they work." Peterson, the head engineer, was still staring at the now functioning machine with a mixture of admiration and professional curiosity. He turned to Tommy with questions of his own. "The way you diagnosed that calibration conflict," Peterson said, shaking his head in amazement. "That's not something you learn from reading manuals. That kind of understanding comes from years of hands-on experience with industrial automation systems. How long has your father been teaching you this stuff?" Tommy's discomfort was becoming more obvious, but he answered honestly. "Since I was little, I guess. Dad always had a workshop behind our house, and I spent most of my free time there with him. He said understanding machines was like learning a language. You had to practice listening to what they were trying to tell you." The investors exchanged glances among themselves, and David could see they were impressed not just by Tommy's technical skills, but by his humble attitude about them. In a world where people often oversold their abilities, here was someone who had just performed what seemed like a miracle and was acting like it was no big deal. Mr. Takeshi pulled out his phone and began taking notes, asking Tommy more detailed questions about his approach to the problem. "When you first heard the machine making that grinding sound, what told you it was a calibration issue rather than a mechanical failure?" Tommy thought for a moment before answering. The rhythm was wrong, but it wasn't random. When mechanical parts break, they usually make chaotic noises. This sounded more like two different systems trying to work together, but getting their timing mixed up. Dad always said that when machines argue with each other, it's usually because someone changed the conversation without telling both sides. The simple way Tommy explained complex technical concepts impressed everyone listening. He had a gift for making complicated ideas sound logical and straightforward, as if anyone should be able to understand them. David's mind was racing with questions. How had a summer worker from the packaging department learned to think like a senior engineer? Why was someone with these skills working a minimum wage job instead of pursuing a career in engineering? And most importantly, who was this father who had taught a teenager to solve problems that stumped college-educated professionals? "What's your father's name?" David asked, trying to sound casual despite his growing curiosity. If he's got experience with industrial machinery, maybe we should be talking to him about a consulting position. For the first time since the conversation began, Tommy's expression showed real hesitation. It was as if David had asked about something deeply personal, something that Tommy wasn't sure he should share with strangers. "His name is Robert Morrison," Tommy said finally, his voice even quieter than before. "But I don't think he'd be interested in consulting work. He's pretty happy with farming these days." The name hit David like a physical blow. Robert Morrison. The blood drained from his face so quickly that Peterson asked if he was feeling all right. David's mouth opened and closed without making any sound, as if he had forgotten how to speak. The investors noticed David's sudden change in demeanor with concern. Mr. Takeshi stepped closer, studying David's pale complexion with the sharp attention of someone who had built his career on reading people's reactions. "Do you know this Robert Morrison?" Mr. Takeshi asked David directly. "You look like you have seen a ghost." David's mind was spinning back through time, pulling up memories he had spent years trying to forget. Robert Morrison. The name belonged to a chapter of his life that he had worked hard to close, a story he had never told anyone in the factory, not even Peterson, who had worked for him for over a decade. Tommy noticed David's strange reaction and felt a flutter of worry in his stomach. Had he said something wrong? His father had always been private about his past, never talking much about his life before they moved to the farm. Tommy knew his dad had worked in technology before he was born, but Robert Morrison had always changed the subject whenever Tommy asked for details. I might have heard the name before," David managed to say, his voice sounding strange and distant. "In the engineering community, you know. It's not that uncommon a name." But his reaction had been too strong, too immediate, for such a casual explanation. The investors could sense there was more to the story, and Tommy was beginning to realize that his father's past might be more complicated than he had ever imagined. Mr. Takeshi, with the instincts of a man who had negotiated countless business deals, pressed further. "This Robert Morrison who taught your son about machines," he said to Tommy. "What kind of technology work did he do before he became a farmer?" Tommy shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "He doesn't really like to talk about it," Tommy said. "All I know is that he used to work for a technology company, designing systems and solving problems. But something happened, and he decided he wanted a simpler life." Your words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, and David felt as if everyone could see right through him. A technology company, designing systems, solving problems. The description fit perfectly with the Robert Morrison he had once known, the brilliant engineer who had been his partner, his mentor, and eventually his victim. Peterson was watching the entire exchange with growing confusion. He had never seen his boss react this way to anything, and the mysterious connection between David and this kid's father was obviously more significant than anyone was letting on. The machine continued, its steady operation in the background, its perfect rhythm now seeming to mock David's growing discomfort. The very technology that had made his company successful, the innovations that had built his reputation and his fortune, suddenly felt like evidence of crimes he had tried to forget. Tommy looked around at the faces surrounding him, sensing undercurrents He didn't understand, but knowing that his simple answer about his father had somehow changed everything. David's legs felt weak as the memories came flooding back with painful clarity. 23 years ago, he had been a young, ambitious engineer with big dreams but no money to make them reality. Robert Morrison had been everything David wasn't: brilliant, patient, and blessed with the kind of innovative mind that could see solutions where others saw only problems. They had met at a technology conference where Robert was presenting his groundbreaking work on automated manufacturing systems. David had been in the audience, mesmerized by Robert's vision of factories that could run themselves with minimal human intervention. After the presentation, David had approached Robert with an idea for starting a company together. Robert had been hesitant at first. He was already working for a large corporation, earning a comfortable salary, and had a young family to support. His wife had just given birth to their first child, a son they had named Tommy. But David was persistent, painting pictures of the fortune they could make and the revolutionary impact they could have on manufacturing worldwide. The early days of their partnership had been magical. Robert's technical genius combined with David's business ambition created innovations that no one else in the industry could match. They worked 18-hour days in a rented garage, surviving on coffee and pure excitement about what they were building together. Robert had developed the core technologies that would eventually become the foundation of modern automated manufacturing. His designs were years ahead of anything else in the market, combining mechanical precision with software intelligence in ways that seemed almost impossible at the time. David handled the business side, finding investors, negotiating contracts, and building the company structure around Robert's innovations. For 5 years, they had been unstoppable. Their company grew from 2 guys in a garage to a major player in industrial automation. Robert's name was on dozens of patents. His designs were revolutionizing factories around the world, and their friendship seemed unbreakable. But success changed David in ways he didn't recognize at the time. As the company grew bigger and more profitable, he became obsessed with expansion and market dominance. Robert, meanwhile, remained focused on the engineering challenges and the satisfaction of solving complex problems. The gap between their priorities grew wider with each passing month. The breaking point came during a heated board meeting about the company's future direction. David wanted to rush new products to market to beat their competitors, even if it meant cutting corners on testing and quality control. Robert insisted on maintaining their standards, arguing that their reputation for reliability was more valuable than short-term profits. The argument that followed was brutal and personal. David accused Robert of being naive about business realities, while Robert questioned whether David had lost sight of why they had started the company in the first place. Other board members took sides, and the partnership that had once seemed unbreakable began to crumble. What happened next was something David had spent years trying to justify to himself. But standing here watching Robert's son, he could no longer ignore the truth about his actions. When Robert threatened to leave the company rather than compromise his principles, David saw an opportunity instead of a tragedy. Using his knowledge of the company's financial structure and his relationships with key investors, David had orchestrated a carefully planned betrayal. He convinced the board that Robert was holding back the company's growth, that his perfectionist tendencies were costing them millions in lost opportunities. Behind Robert's back, David negotiated deals that would dilute Robert's ownership and reduce his control over the company's direction. The legal maneuvering was complex, but the result was simple. Robert found himself forced out of the company he had helped create, with his stake bought out for a fraction of what it was actually worth. David had used Robert's own honesty against him, exploiting clauses in their partnership agreement that Robert had never imagined would be used maliciously. Robert had tried to fight the buyout in court, but David's lawyers were better funded and more ruthless. The legal battle dragged on for 2 years, draining Robert's savings and destroying his reputation in the industry. Companies that had once competed to hire him suddenly wouldn't return his phone calls. The engineering community, hearing whispers about the legal disputes, began to see Robert as a troublemaker rather than an innovator. Eventually, broken and financially ruined, Robert had given up the fight. He took his family and disappeared from the technology world entirely, leaving David free to build an empire on the foundation of Robert's stolen innovations. The patents that Robert had developed became the cornerstone of David's success, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue over the following decades. David had told himself at the time that he was just being pragmatic, that Robert's idealism would have destroyed the company anyway. He convinced himself that he had saved Robert's innovations from being wasted, that putting them to profitable use was better than letting them gather dust while Robert pursued his perfectionist dreams. But standing here now, watching Tommy's innocent face as the young man demonstrated the same brilliant problem-solving abilities that had made his father famous, David could no longer hide from what he had done. He had stolen not just Robert's company and his innovations, but his future and his reputation. He had turned one of the most promising engineers of his generation into a forgotten farmer. The investors were still asking questions, but David could barely hear them over the roar of guilt and panic in his head. Mr. Takeshi was particularly interested in learning more about Robert's background, sensing that there was a story here that could affect their business decision. "This Robert Morrison," Mr. Takeshi said to Tommy. "He must have been very successful in technology to teach you so much. What company did he work for? We might know of his work in our industry." Tommy looked uncomfortable with the continued questions about his father's past. "He doesn't really talk about those days," Tommy said quietly. "I think something bad happened that made him want to leave it all behind. He just tells me that he learned it's better to build things that help people than to worry about making money from them." The simple statement hit David like a physical blow. Even after everything that had happened, Robert had continued to teach his son the same principles that had made him such an extraordinary engineer. While David had spent decades chasing profits and market share, Robert had been passing on the pure love of problem-solving and innovation to the next generation. Peterson, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, suddenly spoke up with a realization that made David's blood run cold. "Wait a minute," Peterson said, his engineering mind making connections that the others had missed. "Morrison, Robert Morrison. I remember that name from some old patent filings I researched when I first started working here. Didn't he develop some of the core technologies that our early products were based on?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. David felt trapped between his past and present, knowing that any answer he gave would lead to more questions he wasn't prepared to handle. The investors were now looking at him with sharp curiosity, sensing that they had stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple machine repair. Tommy looked around at the faces surrounding him, finally beginning to understand that his father's past was somehow connected to this factory, to David, and to the very machines he had just repaired. The innocent question about his father's name had opened a door that David had spent 20 years trying to keep locked. The silence on the factory floor stretched on as Peterson's words echoed in everyone's minds. David felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that one wrong step would send everything he had built crashing down. The investors were watching him with increasing curiosity, and Tommy's confused expression was breaking his heart in ways he hadn't expected. Peterson, unaware of the emotional bomb he had just dropped, continued his train of thought. "Yeah, I'm sure of it now. Robert Morrison was listed as the primary inventor on some of our foundational patents. The automated calibration systems, the sensor integration protocols, those were all his designs. I always wondered why we never heard about him in the industry after those early innovations." Mr. Takeshi's eyes sharpened with the intensity of a man who had spent decades analyzing business deals and spotting inconsistencies. "Mr. Chen," he said, his voice carrying a new edge of authority, "perhaps you could explain to us the relationship between your company and this Robert Morrison. It seems like quite a coincidence that his son would end up working here." David's mouth felt dry as sandpaper. Every possible answer seemed to lead deeper into a web of lies he could no longer maintain. He looked at Tommy, who was staring at him with growing understanding dawning in his young eyes. "My father worked here?" Tommy asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the humming of the machinery. "Is that why you looked so strange when I said his name?" The innocence in Tommy's question made David's guilt even more unbearable. This young man had just saved his company from disaster, had impressed international investors with his remarkable skills, and had no idea that he was standing in the building his father had helped design, surrounded by technology his father had invented. David found himself remembering a conversation he'd had with Robert years ago, back when they were still friends and partners. Robert had been working late one night, fine-tuning the calibration algorithms that Tommy had just repaired with such casual expertise. When David asked why he was putting in such long hours on what seemed like minor adjustments, Robert had smiled and said something that now felt like a prophecy. "I'm not just building this for us, David," Robert had said, his hands still working on the complex code. "Someday I want to teach my son how all of this works. I want him to understand that technology isn't about making money. It's about solving problems and making life better for people. If I do this right, maybe he'll carry on this work long after I'm gone." The memory hit David like a physical blow. Robert hadn't just lost his company and his career. He had lost his dream of building a legacy in technology that he could share with his son. Instead, Tommy had grown up on a farm, learning his father's brilliant engineering skills in secret, never knowing that his talents could have made him famous in the industry his father had helped create. Mr. Takeshi was growing impatient with David's silence. "Mr. Chen, we are beginning to sense that there is more to this story than you are telling us. In my experience, when business partners become uncomfortable discussing their company's history, it usually means there are problems we should know about before we invest our money." The other investors nodded in agreement, and David realized that his years of success were about to unravel because of his inability to face the truth about his past. He had built his empire on stolen innovations, and now the son of the man he had betrayed was standing in front of him, demonstrating the same genius that David had claimed credit for decades ago. Tommy was putting the pieces together with the same methodical intelligence he had shown while diagnosing the machine problem. His father's reluctance to talk about his past, the way Robert's face would cloud over whenever technology companies appeared in the news, the bitterness that sometimes crept into his voice when he talked about choosing principles over profit. "You knew my father," Tommy said, and it wasn't a question anymore. "You worked together, didn't you? And something happened that made him leave." David looked into Tommy's eyes and saw not anger, but a desperate need to understand why his brilliant father had chosen to hide his talents on a small farm instead of changing the world with his innovations. The truth was going to hurt, but lying would only make everything worse. "Yes," David said finally, his voice cracking with emotion. "Your father and I were partners. We started this company together 23 years ago. He designed most of the technology that made us successful." The admission hung in the air like smoke, and David could see the investors exchanging glances that told him his business deal was probably over. But for the first time in years, he felt a strange sense of relief at finally telling the truth. Tommy's expression shifted through confusion, realization, and then something that looked almost like disappointment. "If you were partners, why did he leave? Why doesn't he ever talk about those days?" David took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would probably destroy any chance of respect or forgiveness, but unable to continue lying to this remarkable young man who deserved better. "Because I forced him out," David said quietly. "Your father wanted to maintain certain standards, to take time to perfect our products before rushing them to market. I thought he was holding us back from making more money. So I used legal tricks and political maneuvering to buy out his share of the company for much less than it was worth. I turned the other investors against him and made it impossible for him to stay." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread across everyone listening. Peterson's face showed complete bewilderment, as if his understanding of his boss had just been turned upside down. The investors looked like men who had just discovered that the business deal they were considering was built on a foundation of betrayal and stolen ideas. But it was Tommy's reaction that cut David the deepest. The young man didn't show anger or hatred. Instead, his expression showed a kind of profound sadness, as if he was finally understanding why his father had become so quiet and withdrawn whenever the past came up in conversation. "He never told me," Tommy said softly. "All these years he never said anything bad about you. When I asked why he left technology, He just said that sometimes good people make bad choices, and that forgiveness was more important than being right. The simple statement hit everyone like a thunderbolt. Here was a man who had been betrayed, cheated, and destroyed by his former partner, and he had chosen to teach his son about forgiveness instead of revenge. While David had spent decades building his fortune on Robert's stolen innovations, Robert had been teaching his son the kind of character that David had lost somewhere along the way. Mr. Takeshi spoke into the stunned silence with the measured tone of a man who had just witnessed something that went far beyond business. Mr. Chen, this changes everything about our potential partnership. But before we discuss business matters, I think you owe this young man and his father a much larger conversation than we can have here today. David nodded, knowing that Mr. Takeshi was right. The business deal that had seemed so important that morning now felt trivial compared to the moral debt he owed to the Morrison family. He had spent 23 years trying to justify his actions, but standing here facing the son of the man he had wronged, all his excuses crumbled away. Tommy looked around at the massive factory, at the humming machines his father had helped design, at the technology that could have made the Morrison name famous in engineering circles around the world. Then he looked back at David with an expression that somehow contained both understanding and profound disappointment. "I need to go home and talk to my father," Tommy said quietly. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about the past." As Tommy walked away, David realized that the most important decision of his life wasn't about business deals or investor meetings. It was about whether he finally had the courage to face the man he had wronged and try to make amends for the choices that had haunted him for over 2 decades.